Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Can I attain success and salvation by only doing what is fard? Immediately, what comes to mind on this question is the hadith wherein the Bedouin comes to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wasallam, and he asks the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, what are the duties that are expected of me as a Muslim? And the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam then goes on to list the various acts of worship that Islam holds as obligatory, namely the 5 daily prayers, zakah, fasting in the month of Ramadan, and the performance of Hajj. These are what we regard as the pillars of Islam. Of course, then the Shahada is a prerequisite to all of that. However, what's interesting about this incident is that this Bedouin, who's of course a Sahabi, we don't know his name, we don't know much details about him, but he asks Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in each instance, is there anything else that I should do in addition to what you've mentioned? So, for example, the Prophet ﷺ would mention praying 5 times a day, every single day, within its prescribed time. And then the Bedouin would ask, should I do anything beyond that? Is anything else expected of me? And the answer that the Prophet ﷺ gives is, no, except that you except that you do supererogatory or voluntary deeds that you will of course be rewarded for. So, this follows through the entire process. He asks about salah, he asks about zakah, he asks about fasting in Ramadan, he asks about Hajj. And each time the Prophet ﷺ indicates that you only owe that which is obligatory, that which is mentioned, and beyond that you may volunteer to do extra. So when the Bedouin then leaves, he then tells the Prophet ﷺ, I'm only going to do that, meaning I'm only going to suffice myself with that which is fard or obligatory. So the Prophet ﷺ, interestingly, he says that this person, he will be successful if he is truthful. He will be successful if he is truthful. Now, herein lies the key. So the Shafi'i school relies on this hadith in many instances within the madhab to demonstrate that a particular act of worship is not obligatory but rather sunnah. For example, in the Shafi'i school, the witr prayer is regarded as sunnah. It is sunnah mu'akkada, an emphasized sunnah, meaning that the Prophet ﷺ wouldn't leave this off except to demonstrate that it is not compulsory. But the Prophet ﷺ would be punctual with these acts of worship. So in the Shafi'i school, this provides us with evidence that many acts of worship, like the witr salah, is not fard or not wajib as it is held in other schools of thought, but rather that it is sunnah according to the school of Imam Ash-Shafi'i rahimahullah ta'ala. So the question is essentially answered in this hadith. Can I attain success by only doing that which is fard? The answer is yes, you can if you are truthful. And this rider at the end really contextualizes the statement. The sunnah is there not to make our lives difficult, but in fact to make our path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala easier for us. So by omitting the sunnah, we automatically create a difficulty for ourselves. And that difficulty lies in not having a barrier between ourselves and disobeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So for a person who only does what is absolutely obligatory, for example, they only pray the fard salah of Fajr, the fard salah of Dhuhr, there's nothing that remains between this person and the omission of their fard. And the moment that they missed the fard, this is when they fell below the line, if they were treading that line between good and evil, essentially. So what we have left with is, if you are disciplined enough to only do the fard and to be consistent thereon, you may attain success, because that is essentially a'malus salihat. It is to refrain from haram and to do what is fard. However, in the age that we are living in, there are so many distractions, temptations, and ways to become astray, ways to be led astray off the Sirat al-Mustaqim, that it's difficult for anyone to claim that they genuinely have the ability to remain consistent on that which is fard and to never ever go below that line. So we don't want to limit ourselves to that which is only fard for 2 reasons. Number one, it's because it's a dangerous thing to do, knowing that the next step is to go into that which is haram or to omit that which is a necessary duty for a Muslim. And number 2, we will be depriving ourselves of the tremendous blessings and reward that accompanies the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wasallam. There's a third danger, but this is a tremendous danger, and of course we would assume that this doesn't apply to anyone asking this question, and that is if you want to abandon the sunnah because you don't regard it as important, you don't regard the sunnah as necessary for our salvation, so you look down upon the sunnah. This has now become sinful. This is absolutely sinful, and you should refrain from such an attitude towards the sunnah entirely. So the last point that I'd advise in this regard is to be careful as to how we ask questions, how we approach our deen. Don't approach the deen from the perspective of what's the least that I can do, or what's the absolute minimum that I can do. Don't approach the deen from will I get punished for this? Will I get punished for not doing that? Instead, approach Islam from the perspective of what's best for me. What's best for my relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? What is best for my dunya and my akhirah? And I will pursue that which is best according to my ability. And the definition of the sunnah really should guide us in relation to this. In Islamic legal theory, the sunnah is defined as those acts which, if you do them, you'll be rewarded. But if you don't do them, you'll not be held accountable for punishment. What we should focus on with this definition is the fact that we'll get rewarded for doing those acts. And that should be our guiding principle, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, as opposed to what's the least that I can do? Or even worse, saying that, okay, that's just the sunnah, I don't need to do that. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best.
La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah.